So this folio started with the idea of just using 2 envelopes, and these are A7 envelopes that I purchased off of Amazon several years ago, and I use these all the time in my projects. I'm also going to be using Gilded Tapestry by Line Dot Arrow, and I've gone ahead and cut out the tags. There's 6 tags in this kit, and I've just printed the paper on one side. Since we'll be gluing this paper down to the envelopes, we don't need it printed on both sides. I did print some of the sheets on 32-pound premium paper and then some on 110-pound cardstock. And I'll show you as I go along why I did that. And this is some of the embellishments that come with the kit. So to get started, we're going to use 2 of the A7 envelopes. You're also going to need a piece of craft cardstock that measures 3 by 7 1/4 if you're using the same size envelopes as I am. If not, then just cut it to match the height of your envelope. So I am scoring at 1 1/4 and then again at 1 3/4. So this is going to be the spine of our journal. So I just want to fold my paper on the score lines that we created just to get that ready to bend. And then we're just going to glue each of the envelopes to one side of this little spine piece. And this is the way we're going to connect our envelopes together. And so I am using craft cardstock to match my envelope. So if you have a different color envelope, because I have red ones kind of like this as well that I've gotten from Michael's, and I have white ones. So depending on what color you're using, you may want to match it to the color. But we are going to cover this with paper later. I do leave part of my spine showing, but you could totally cover it all in paper and it would not matter what color you used. But I just used the craft cardstock because that was thick enough. I felt like that would hold the journal together, you know, nicely along with the paper that we're going to be adding to it later. So you'll see here that I am adding glue to the actual spine piece as well as the envelope, because it's easier this way for me so that I don't put the glue in the wrong place on the spine piece, and that way everything can stick together. And one thing to keep in mind is when you are gluing this, be sure to line up the top and the bottom, and do not glue your envelopes over on your score lines. Leave a little room there so that your cover can open and close without binding up at all. So for the next set of envelopes, I want to create my own envelopes, and I want to create them so that they fit a card size 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So that's what I'm using as my guide on my punch board. And so for this one, you cut your paper 8 by 8, and then you're going to do your scoring. And I'm going to be using my 110-pound cardstock for this. So I printed these papers on the 110-pound cardstock so that they'd be very thick and very sturdy envelopes, since I'm going to be using the flap to flip in and out, and so that strengthens it pretty well to use the 110-pound cardstock. So I'm going to make 2 of these, and I want them to be different colors, so I'm not going to make them matching. I'm making 2 different sheets from the kit. So to attach these envelopes, I've got to decide, I'm going to use one of the flaps. It's going to be the top flap, but I have to decide which direction I want these envelopes to go, because it is sort of, the print is sideways when I make these envelopes, but that's okay with me. I just want to decide which way that I want them. So once I decide, I am going to go ahead and punch the bottom flap so that it's not so sharp, pulling your, like when you're putting your papers in and out of the envelope, at least that piece won't be so sharp. So that's why I'm punching it only. And that just rounds it so that it's more smooth and not as sharp of a point. And that way I know when I'm adding these which one's going at the top and which one's going at the bottom. So once I decide on that, I am going to go ahead and glue my envelope shut as far as the bottom part. I'm going to leave the top flap open. So we're going to use that to glue to our other envelope. So I'm going to center these up top to bottom, and then all I'm going to do is add a lot of glue to the entire flap. So I'm just going to cover this flap with glue, and then I'm going to attach that to the front of our cover, or the back cover as well. I'm just going to attach it to our other envelopes. And all of this is going to get covered up by our paper when we start embellishing. So there we have our cover created for our folio. So I've just cut all of my papers to fit my flaps and my envelopes, and what I've done is I like the color of my envelopes, so I want to use that to frame out each piece of paper. So normally what I do is I cut my papers to fit everything and cut it down 1/4 of an inch. So there's about 1/8 inch around each border. So since this was a 7 1/4 tall envelope, I'm cutting the height on my pieces to 7 inches tall. And then for the width, it just varies for each piece, but I'm just taking 1/4 inch off. So if the piece was 2 inches wide, for example, then I would cut it 1 3/4. So I take about 1/4 of an inch off. And so for these flaps, I did that. I just used my corner punch to punch the corners so that they'd be more rounded. And then for the inside piece, I've just cut a large piece of paper to fit the entire piece of the inside minus the 1/4 of an inch from the top and the bottom. And hopefully that makes sense. I like to do that so that the paper behind it kind of frames out your paper. You don't have to do that. You could cover this entirely and not worry about cutting it down smaller, but I like to see these envelopes behind it. Now I did go through and ink my envelopes and ink all the edges of the papers. I didn't grunge them up a lot, but I did ink the edges some. And I think that just finishes off the edges where you cut them. Now for the spine, when you glue this down, you want to get your bone folder or some sort of tool. This tool I'm using here is from the Dollar Tree. And you just want to press down in your spine as well as follow those. You can see how I'm going into the groove where we scored for our spine, the 1/2 inch spine width. So where we scored that spot, I'm going and pressing down. And the reason I'm doing this is so that my paper gets glued down really well. And then you want to be careful and just fold your paper over and get those creases back in where you had those score lines. You want to crease that back into the paper that you put on the inside. And you want to be gentle with this because you don't want to buckle your inside paper. And you can see since mine's wet, it's starting to buckle a little bit. So I'm just going back with my tool and smoothing it down. And we're smoothing on the spine like that so that when you get all of this folded up and your journal is closed, you can see that your paper is not buckling or puckering so that you can, it's not like a gap in there. You keep that smooth and there's no gap. And so that was my whole intention of pressing it down. So just spend a little time pressing on it and getting it nice and smooth and glued down. And that way you won't have any puckering in your spine. So for the cover, I've just cut down a piece of the paper that I wanted for the cover. And once again, I'm just cutting it 1/4 inch smaller and adding it to the front. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the back cover. Now you could cut a strip to cover your spine, but I've decided to leave my spine showing with the brown paper. So now I want to add some pockets to the envelopes that we created. So the front side of the envelope, which we would call normally, is kind of plain and there's nothing on it. So I thought I would add a pocket. So I'm just taking some book pages that I have and I've cut them just 1/4 inch larger than my little rectangle of the printed paper. And I'm going to add that to my envelopes. And I think that just frames it out and it helps you actually to see that it is a pocket and something added to the envelope. If I would just have added the paper, it would have kind of just blended in. Also, by adding the book page to it, it's thickening my pocket up so it makes it a little bit sturdier pocket as well. So we're almost done with our folio, and then we'll just need to add the journal in it. So once I add the journal, that's when I'll decorate the whole cover up. But for now, I want to add a pocket to the back here, and I want an envelope style pocket, and I don't have that envelope size here. So I'm going to make my own, and I'm going to show you how. So for this back pocket or envelope, I want a 4.5 by 6.5 envelope. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use 8.5 by 11 sheet of cardstock, and this matches the envelopes that I was using, or close enough that I think it will look good. And then I'm going to add the digitals to it, the paper to it later. So let's just make the envelope first. So to make the envelope 4.5 by 6.5, I'm going to take and put the 11-inch side to the top of my scoring board. And then I'm going to score at 2.5 inches. And once I put this together, it will make sense. It may not make sense as I'm doing it. So after I score at 2.5, I know that I want my envelope to be 4.5 inches wide. So I can just count 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a half. So that means I'm going to score at 7. So that way my envelope is 4.5 inches wide. The next spot that we're going to score is, we need another, about 3 inches is what I'm going to do, just to make sure that I have enough. So here we got 1, 2, and 3. So we're going to score at the 10-inch mark. And so that score mark is going to be where we cut our paper. So then I'll cut it in a few minutes. I'm just putting score lines in so I know where to cut as well. So we're going to turn our paper so that we have the 8.5 inch side to the top. And then we're going to say this is the top of our envelope and this is the bottom. So for the bottom of the envelope, we are going to score at 3.25 inches. So at 3/4 inches, 3/4 inch, maybe I said that wrong. At 3/4 inch, we're going to score at the 3/4 mark. And then we're going to score again at 7.25. And that will be our top flap. And my paper is fairly thick, so I'm having to go back and forth several times with it to get a deep enough score mark. So here we have our score lines. So let's get our scissors out. So now we're going to cut on this, right on the left-hand side of that score mark. We're just going to cut that off, and that is just a little extra piece that was on our paper. It was easier for me to do the scoring and then cut. If for you want to go ahead and cut your paper down to the right size, you could do that. Okay, so now let's take a look. We need to remove this little rectangle here and this rectangle. So we're just going to cut this time on the right-hand side of the score line. And then I'm just going to cut down through the score line there. And that's going to remove one of the rectangles. And then for the next one, we're going to cut right through the score line there, all the way up to the next score line. And then you want to cut on the left-hand side here, or you're cutting your score line off. So you want to leave your flaps, so you're cutting your score line off. And if you cut the whole score line off, that cuts enough off that you probably won't have to trim your flaps when you get done. So if you don't get enough, you can always go back and trim. So then we're going to remove this rectangle and this rectangle, just like we did the top one. Remembering that we're going to cut the score line totally off. So then this one we're going to do the same. You're going to cut your score line off, and then you're just going to cut right there in the score line to make your flaps. And hopefully this makes sense now. I know at first it may not have made sense if you're new to making envelopes. And so then right here at the bottom here, I'm just going to cut out just a little triangle. It just seems to help everything fold together better when you take some of that little bulk out of your corners. And then for the top flap, I want to use my corner punch, and I'm just going to round the corners at the top one. And so then we can just fold it together. And when you go to fold it together, if you didn't trim enough of your score line off, that's going to be okay, because you can just go back and trim again. And the way you will know is if it feels bulky and doesn't want to fold up. And that one folded up just fine. So you do want to score. Use your scoring tool or your bone folder, which I cannot find mine, so I'm just going to use the side of my scissors to press this down. And hopefully I'll find it in this pile of papers I have on my desk. And so then this one you just want to test and see. So if for some reason when you fold this, it doesn't fold flat, or this one doesn't fold flat, just go back and trim a little bit off of each one of these flaps' edge. And so then you can just decide which direction you want, but we're going to cover this up with paper anyway. So let's go ahead and glue it up. Oops. I pulled the little plastic piece off here that seals up my glue. I had to put that back on. And I'm just going to run some glue down the edge here. and just run some glue along the bottom flap here. There we go. And we'll just leave the top flap open so we can stick things in there. So now we're just going to cover this, and what I typically like to do is I just like to cut the paper to fit about 1/4 of an inch smaller. So since this measures 4 1/2, I'm just going to cut my paper down to 4 1/4 inches wide. So I want to get this bird on here, so I'm just going to try to measure and see what size that, I think that's going to be perfect. So I'm just going to trim down through here, and then I'm going to turn them over, and I'm going to be 4 1/4. Oops. And then the envelope itself measures 6 1/2 inches tall. So I want to measure it, I want to cut it at 6 1/4. And I did have to cut my butterfly off some, but that's okay. So then we'll just see if that fits. I always like to come back and make sure. So that fits. And now we want to cut the piece for the flap. The flap is 1 1/4. So we're going to cut our strip of paper 1 inch, and then by the width, which is 4 1/4. And so we'll just round the corners to match. But before I round the corners, I need to be sure that I have it the orientation that I want it. So I think I'm wanting it about probably like that. I think that will be fine. So I'm just going to round these 2 corners here at the bottom. And so that fits perfectly on our little envelope, and then we'll add this. So I'm going to ink these up, and then we'll glue them on. And I do want to show you, with these flimsier 32-pound paper, you know, it's hard for me to ink the edges. So I found that if I just pull up my glue book, you know, it's an extra book that I have where I cut out to use the cover for, you know, another journal. I'm just saving the pages, and I use them to, you know, to glue on and stuff and get my glue on. But they also work perfect for inking the edges like this. And you can see I've already been doing this throughout this whole journal. This is how I've been inking the edges. And I just find that it works easier for me. So I thought I'd show you that little trick in case you were interested in trying it. So I'm going to attach my envelope to the back of the folio cover, but for the closure, I want the envelope to stay closed, and I could add something here and wrap a string around, but then I think it's going to be bulky because your journal's going to be on the inside that you're going to be using and trying to write in. I think it's going to make it difficult. So since I don't want anything bulky, I'm just going to use these Velcro dots from the Dollar Tree, and these are in the craft section at the Dollar Tree. And so I think that these will be exactly what I need. So let me what I like to do is just stick them together, and then I'll attach it to the flap. So I have my 2 Velcro pieces stuck, and then I'm just going to eyeball on the flap here where I want them. Just kind of centering it up. They're very sticky, so you kind of have to know where you're going to put it before you stick it down. And then I'm just going to fold it over and press, and that way the dots line up perfectly. And they don't add a lot of bulk to, I'm just going to press it down to the journal. So that way when you're writing in this journal, you don't have a lot of bulk added. And then you can put anything in here, and you can even add another smaller journal in here if you wanted to. So I'm just going to attach it to the back now. I am making sure that I have right side up, and then I'm going to attach it here. And there, we're going to add, let me open this up just to press it down. That makes it easier pressing it all down. Just open my folio up, and we have another pocket. So I like that added. So I think this is a good stopping point, and in the next video we'll continue working on this journal. I hope that you are enjoying this process, and if you're watching this after it comes out weeks later, there should be links below to all of the videos. Well, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.